Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Some stories seem to cross distances with uncomfortably easy ease. The house was located on North 2nd Street in Atchison, Kansas, a town too small to hide big secrets. Built in the late 19th century, the two-story residence didn't immediately draw attention. A simple facade, aged wood, a narrow porch that creaked under any firm footstep. Yet there was something about it that seemed out of sync with the rest of the street. It wasn't abandonment nor decay. It was tension, as if the space were permanently waiting for something that never came. When Tony Pickman first walked through the front door, he felt it without knowing how to name it. He didn't believe in houses with personality. He was a skeptic, trained in behavioral psychology, used to explaining fear as a chemical reaction, and learned conditioning. The move to Atchison had been motivated by pragmatism: cheap rent, a quiet town, a comfortable distance from the recent past. The house on North 2nd Street seemed merely a functional choice. Deborah, his wife, noticed something different in the first few days. She didn't mention ghosts or curses. She simply observed strange behaviors in the house: doors that never seemed to stay fully open, rooms that required constant lighting even during the day, a basement that caused immediate physical discomfort, like a sudden drop in blood pressure. None of this was supernatural in itself. They were details, and details, when accumulated, create patterns. The first incident occurred at night, a few days after the move. Tony woke up with the clear feeling of being watched. There was no noise, no shadow, no dream he remembered, only the physical primal certainty that he was not alone. He got up, walked through the house with controlled steps, checking doors and windows. Everything was closed. The most logical explanation, stress, adaptation to the new environment, seemed sufficient at that moment. But the house began to respond. Objects moved around without any logical purpose. They didn't disappear. They reappeared in improbable places, as if someone wanted to be noticed but not confronted. The guest room door slammed shut with disproportionate force, despite any draft. The thermostat malfunctioned only at certain times, always at night. The house's behavior wasn't chaotic, it was persistent. The antagonism didn't come from a visible figure, but from the space itself. The house didn't attack directly, it wore you down. It deprived you of sleep, distorted routines, induced mistakes. Tony began to make small errors at work, lapses in attention that had never been part of his history. Deborah began to avoid certain rooms without consciously realizing why. The basement became forbidden territory by silent consensus. Doubt gradually crept in. It wasn't fear yet. It was a fracture in the trust they both had in the predictability of the world. Tony insisted on rational explanations, but he could no longer ignore the regularity of events. The house seemed to react to their presence, as if the occupation had awakened something latent, not in a mystical sense, but a psychological one. An architecture that amplified tension, an environment that pushed human limits. The name Sallie emerged almost accidentally, mentioned by a neighbor during a casual conversation about the house's history. A child, an old death. A story passed down through generations, without clear official records. Tony dismissed the narrative as local folklore, an attempt to give identity to the inexplicable. Still, the name stuck. It came to be used as a reference, as if the house demanded a name for the discomfort it caused. The main conflict was already established, although no one had verbalized it: to remain and resist, or to admit that there was something in that space that escaped the traditional tools of understanding. It wasn't about believing or not believing in ghosts. It was about recognizing that the environment was imposing real, measurable changes on the couple's behavior and emotional health. The house didn't scream. It didn't threaten. It observed, pressed, and waited. And in that seemingly tranquil beginning, it was already clear that escaping unscathed would depend not only on courage or logic, but on the ability to recognize when reality ceases to conform to known rules. Atchison was a town built upon layers of unresolved past. Founded on the banks of the Missouri River, it had grown as a strategic point in the 19th century, marked by territorial disputes, silent violence, and a rigid religiosity that coexisted with superstitions never fully abandoned. The old houses on North 2nd Street were not just residences, they were witnesses. Each carried stories that rarely appeared in official records, but survived in the collective memory. Tony began to notice this while interacting with the locals. The conversations were cordial, but selective. Some topics flowed naturally: weather, work, routine, and others provoked subtle pauses. When Sallie House was mentioned, the tone changed. No one seemed willing to delve into details, but no one denied that something there wasn't normal. There was no hysteria, just caution. Deborah, for her part, reacted more sensitively to her surroundings. She didn't seek immediate explanations, but absorbed the house as one recognizes a danger before understanding it. Her movements became more calculated. She avoided walking barefoot. She kept doors closed even during the day. The kitchen, curiously, was the only space where she seemed to regain some sense of control, perhaps because it was a functional, predictable environment, anchored in concrete tasks. The basement remained the epicenter of discomfort. It wasn't dark, the lights worked perfectly, nor excessively damp. Still, the feeling of descending the stairs was one of intrusion. The space seemed smaller than it actually was, as if it were compressing anyone who entered. Tony tried to use it as a storage room, forcing a normalization of the environment, but each visit required a disproportionate effort. The body reacted before the mind, quickening the pulse, altering the breathing. The history of the house began to unfold in fragments. A former resident mentioned that for a short period, a kind of makeshift clinic had operated there at the end of the 19th century. Another cited the death of a child after a botched medical procedure, something common in an era of rudimentary practices. No version entirely coincided with the other. The name Sallie appeared and disappeared depending on who was telling the story, as if it were not a specific person, but a symbol. The antagonist in the narrative didn't present itself as a clear entity, but as a reactive force. The house responded differently to each occupant, and this was becoming increasingly evident. While Deborah felt a constant, almost oppressive weight, Tony experienced more aggressive events, superficial scratches that appeared without explanation, localized pains, marks that didn't correspond to any remembered accident. The house seemed to test distinct limits in each of them. Secondary characters began to gain relevance. A local paranormal investigator, known for approaching cases with an almost scientific methodology, visited the house out of historical curiosity. His stance was skeptical, but his stay was short. He left without definitive conclusions, only with the recommendation not to underestimate the psychological impact of environments laden with negative narratives. The ambiguity of his reaction left more questions than answers. The neighborhood functioned as a social mirror. No one interfered directly, but everyone observed. The constant presence of curious visitors drawn by rumors began to alter the couple's dynamic. The house, once a refuge, became a point of exhibition. This increased the pressure, making it difficult to separate what was external influence from what was caused by the environment itself. Culturally, Atchison had a contradictory relationship with his past. He was proud of his history, but avoided confronting its most uncomfortable aspects. Sallie House fit perfectly into this contradiction. It was known, discussed, but never fully acknowledged as a problem. The responsibility always seemed to be transferred to whoever decided to live there. The world of the story was consolidating itself as a space where the supernatural never asserted itself openly, but was also never completely discarded. Everything operated on the border between perception, suggestion, and real impact. The house didn't need to explain itself, it only needed to react. And the more Tony tried to understand it, the more evident it became that the conflict wouldn't be resolved with logic or emotional resistance alone. The house ceased to be merely a hostile space and began to act selectively. It didn't attack constantly, nor in a predictable way. There were periods of apparent normality, entire days, without any unusual event. These intervals functioned as psychological traps, restoring a false sense of control before something new, more specific, more invasive, emerged. Tony was the first to realize that the episodes were no longer random. The occurrences began to concentrate on moments of vulnerability, after sleepless nights, after trivial arguments, or when one of them was alone. The house seemed to respond to emotional states, as if it recognized internal tension and amplified it. This made it impossible to separate cause and effect. Was the environment causing the strain, or merely taking advantage of it? The physical attacks became more evident. Not violent in the classical sense, but precise. Scratches appeared on Tony's arms and torso while he slept. Too superficial to bleed much, deep enough to sting for days. The marks followed linear, parallel patterns, incompatible with involuntary movements. He documented everything with photos, trying to transform the inexplicable into concrete evidence. No medical explanation held up. Deborah began to suffer a different kind of aggression. There were no visible marks, but a constant pressure, as if she were being closely watched. In certain rooms, especially the guest room and the basement, her breathing became short, her vision blurred. Objects fell near her, never hitting her directly, but always enough to provoke a reaction. The house didn't hurt Deborah, it surrounded her. The conflict intensified when Tony's behavior began to change. Not out of explicit fear, but out of obsession. He began spending hours analyzing historical accounts, property records, local stories. He tried to piece together a logical line, a causal sequence that would justify the house's behavior. The more he investigated, the more fragmented the narrative became. Each source seemed to contradict the previous one, as if the truth were deliberately unstable. The couple's relationship began to show visible cracks. Deborah wanted to leave, even if only temporarily. Tony interpreted this as premature surrender, a yielding to collective suggestion. Neither of them raised their voice, but the distance grew. The house benefited from this. The most intense events occurred after these silent disagreements, as if the atmosphere reacted to the disunity. Secondary characters began to interfere more directly. A group of amateur researchers requested permission to spend a night in the house, offering monitoring with cameras and basic sensors. Tony accepted, believing that the presence of third parties could disrupt the pattern. The effect was the opposite. During the night, equipment failed simultaneously, batteries discharged without explanation, and one of the visitors panicked when he felt something pulling his clothes in the basement. No audio-visual recording captured the event. These episodes added a new layer to the conflict. The house reacted more aggressively to attempts at systematic observation. It didn't seem to like being analyzed, measured, or exposed. After the researchers' visit, the attacks on Tony intensified, as if in retaliation. He woke up one morning with deeper marks on his chest and a persistent feeling of exhaustion, as if he had been deprived of physical energy. The emotional dynamics of the house also changed. Before, the atmosphere seemed defensive, almost territorial. Now it assumed an active posture. Doors slammed shut when someone approached certain spaces. Footsteps could be heard upstairs, even when both were on the ground floor. There were no clear apparitions, just enough clues to maintain constant tension. The main conflict ceased to be merely about surviving the house and became a critical decision: to continue trying to understand and confront the phenomenon, or to accept that the insistence was worsening the situation. Each attempt at control resulted in a more intense response. Each retreat seemed to give the house a psychological advantage. Tony began to question for the first time his own analytical abilities. Logic, his main tool, no longer offered protection. Deborah, on the other hand, began to act more pragmatically, preparing emergency exits, keeping suitcases half-packed, as if anticipating an inevitable breakup. The conflict had reached a new level. It was no longer about what the house was, but about how much it was willing to do to remain dominant. And at that point, it was clear that ignoring it was no longer a viable option. With the main conflict already established, the house began to act more strategically, exploiting fissures that were not immediately visible. The subplots emerged not as diversions, but as natural extensions of the growing pressure, each deepening the psychological and emotional impact of the environment on its occupants. One of these layers involved involuntary public exposure. Rumors about Sallie House began to intensify, fueled by fragmented visitor accounts and local curiosity. People started parking in front of the house at night, some silently, others trying to provoke reactions. This constant presence altered Deborah's perception of safety, and she began to feel that the house was no longer just hostile inside, but also vulnerable outside. The boundary between private and public space dissolved, amplifying the feeling of being surrounded. Another subplot developed from Tony's physical health. The marks on his body began to show a temporal pattern. They always appeared after nights he stayed awake investigating the history of the house. The accumulated exhaustion affected his judgment, making him more impulsive, less cautious. Still, he interpreted this deterioration as a necessary part of the process, convinced that he was close to a definitive explanation. The house seemed to reinforce this obsession, offering contradictory signs, enough to keep him engaged, but never enlightening. Deborah, in turn, developed an almost ritualistic relationship with the space. She began to rearrange objects, alter the arrangement of furniture, trying to create a minimal sense of control. Small changes provoked disproportionate reactions, more intense noises, localized power outages, doors slamming shut. The house reacted to the attempted reconfiguration, as if rejecting any interference with its internal order. A secondary figure gained importance during this period, a local doctor, a former resident of Atchison, who recognized the address when treating Tony for scratches. Without stating anything directly, he commented that other people had reported similar symptoms after spending long periods in that house. He offered no alternative diagnoses, only recommended staying away from the place. His neutral, almost evasive stance added a new layer of unease, the possibility that this was not an isolated case. Time pressure began to manifest itself indirectly. The rental contract was nearing an automatic renewal clause, forcing the couple to make a practical decision amidst the emotional chaos. The house, as if sensing this urgency, intensified nightly events in the days leading up to the deadline. The narrative pace accelerated, forcing quick choices without room for prolonged reflection. Another subplot involved the city's collective memory. A small group of older residents began to approach, not to help, but to observe. There was an almost anthropological curiosity, as if they wanted to confirm whether the house still worked. None of them offered direct support. The responsibility always remained with whoever occupied the space. This attitude reinforced the idea that Sallie House was a test, an undeclared trial. All these complexities converged on a common point. The household didn't need to act in extreme ways to dominate. It was enough to create multiple simultaneous pressures, social, physical, emotional, until resistance became unsustainable. No subplot developed in isolation. All fueled the central conflict, narrowing the couple's options. At the end of this stage, the narrative was compressed by imminent decisions. Staying meant facing increasingly severe consequences. Leaving implied accepting that there was something there beyond rational comprehension, a concession that Tony still resisted making. The house watched silently as the choices became inevitable. The turning point didn't come with a spectacular event, but with a sudden change in pattern. Until then, the house reacted to the couple's actions, amplifying tensions and exploiting vulnerabilities. That night, for the first time, she took the initiative. It all started in the basement. Tony descended alone, defying a silent agreement that had formed between them. He carried a flashlight, a portable recorder, and copies of old documents he had found in the municipal archives. He didn't expect to find anything new. The descent was almost compulsory, a necessity to confront the space that concentrated most of the activity. The feeling of compression was immediate, more intense than ever. The air seemed denser, the flashlight's light failing at the edges of the room. Without warning, the basement door slammed shut above him. It wasn't a chaotic bang, but a dry, precise impact. Tony ran to the stairs and tried to open the door, but it met resistance. It wasn't locked, it simply seemed to refuse to budge. The wood didn't creak, didn't vibrate. It remained still, as if it were part of the structure. That's when the pain began. There were no pushes or falls. The sensation came from within, a localized pressure in the chest, followed by an intense burning in the arms and back. Tony fell to his knees, trying to control his breathing. The tape recorder fell to the floor, still on. There were no audible voices, but the atmosphere seemed to pulse, as if something were approaching without moving. Upstairs, Deborah heard the door slam shut, and the muffled sound of the tape recorder echoing through the floorboards. She tried to open the basement door, encountering the same unnatural resistance. It wasn't physical force that prevented her, but a lack of response. She called out Tony's name, but received no immediate reply. The house absorbed the sound. When the door finally gave way, Tony was lying on the floor, with marks visibly deeper than any he had ever seen before. They weren't just scratches, there were jagged cuts, as if something had been repeatedly pressed against his skin. He was conscious but disoriented, struggling to speak. The escape from the basement required a physical and emotional effort that surpassed even the most ordinary fear. The repercussions of this event were immediate and irreversible. For the first time, Tony didn't try to rationalize what had happened. He didn't seek environmental or psychological explanations. The silence that followed was more revealing than any statement. The house had crossed a clear line. It had stopped merely reacting and had begun to impose. The revelation came indirectly. Upon listening to the recording made in the basement, the couple noticed something they hadn't seen before. Among the static noises and Tony's heavy breathing, there were rhythmic, almost regular sounds, similar to light tapping. They weren't words, but they had a cadence, a pattern. The house didn't communicate through language, but through repetition. The discovery completely changed the dynamic. Sallie House was neither a chaotic space nor a confused entity. It operated according to its own rules, still unknown, but consistent. The antagonist ceased to be abstract and became an active system with clear limits and responses. Deborah made a decision at that moment. She didn't announce it. She didn't discuss it. She began packing essential items, preparing for a final exit. The house reacted immediately, flickering lights, concentrated noises in the rooms she occupied, as if trying to prevent the advancement of that choice. For the first time, Deborah didn't back down. Tony, weakened, watched in silence. His transformation began there, not as an acceptance of the supernatural, but as a recognition of his own failure. He had underestimated the risk by insisting on understanding something that didn't need to be understood in order to cause harm. The tipping point had been reached. The house had revealed its capacity to act directly and deliberately. The conflict was no longer theoretical or psychological. It had become physical, measurable, and urgent. Staying had ceased to be a matter of rational choice and had become a concrete threat. From that moment on, every action would have immediate consequences. The house had already demonstrated that it didn't need time to adapt. It already knew its occupants better than they knew themselves. The consequences of what had occurred in the basement were not limited to the marks on Tony's body. They spread silently throughout the house, altering the dynamics of the space and the posture of those who remained there. Sallie House did not display triumph, but a denser presence, as if it had consolidated its dominance after the direct confrontation. Tony spent the following days in partial recovery. The wounds healed slowly, leaving irregular marks that did not follow natural healing patterns. The pain was not constant, but came in waves, especially when he approached the basement or tried to resume any investigative activity. His body reacted before his mind, imposing clear limits. For the first time, he respected them. The psychological reaction was even more significant. Tony avoided being alone in any room, not out of explicit fear, but out of an acute perception of vulnerability. Logic, once his shield, now functioned only as a practical tool. He no longer sought answers, only escape routes. This internal change profoundly affected his identity, built around control and analysis. Deborah adopted an active and objective stance. She set schedules, organized the removal of belongings, and maintained constant communication with people outside the house. The preparation to leave was no longer hypothetical. It had become a concrete process. Each packed box seemed to provoke subtle reactions from the environment: creaks in the floorboards, abrupt temperature changes, noises concentrated in the already emptied rooms. The house responded to the imminent abandonment. The relationship between the couple also transformed. The silent distance gave way to a tense, almost strategic cooperation. There were no long arguments or attempts at persuasion. Both understood that time was a critical factor. Communication became functional, direct, devoid of excessive emotion, as if any more intense display could be perceived by the household. The outside environment began to reflect the internal impact. Curious visitors dwindled, replaced by an unusual silence surrounding the residence. The street seemed emptier, as if the house had created a natural exclusion zone. Even during the day, the feeling of isolation persisted. Sallie House no longer needed onlookers. Minor events continued to occur, but with a different character. There was no escalation of violence, only constant reminders of presence. Objects falling too close, doors closing slowly, sounds of footsteps upstairs when no one was there. The house didn't need to prove anything. It had already established its capacity. Tony tried, one last time, to review the footage recorded in the basement. The reaction was immediate, a sharp pain in his chest, similar to what he felt during the incident. He stopped the attempt without hesitation. The message was clear. The house did not allow a revisiting of that moment. The recent past had become an imposed boundary. The consequences also extended to a sense of responsibility. Tony acknowledged that his insistence had contributed to the escalation of the conflict, not as moral guilt, but as a pragmatic realization. The house reacted to provocation, and he had provoked it repeatedly. This acceptance brought no relief, only clarity. Deborah, on the other hand, experienced a form of restrained relief. The decision to leave reduced the psychological pressure, even as the events persisted. She began to avoid any attempt at indirect confrontation, treating the house as a space to be left behind, not confronted. This stance seemed to reduce the intensity of the reactions. At the end of this phase, the narrative was in a state of transition. The central conflict was not resolved, but its nature had changed. It was no longer a matter of understanding or resisting, but of surviving the retreat. The house observed every movement, every choice, as if assessing to what extent it would allow the departure. The consequences were clear. The price of staying had been demonstrated, and the cost of leaving was still uncertain. The next step would require more than courage. It would require rapid adaptation and decisions with no room for error. Overcoming the challenge didn't come as a heroic act or a clear victory. It manifested itself in a restrained, almost invisible way, in the small changes in behavior that came to define the final days at Sallie House. The protagonist's growth wasn't in confronting the house, but in recognizing his own limitations, something he had refused to do until then. Tony began to act with a caution he had never practiced before. He avoided certain times, maintained rigid routines, and interrupted any activity at the first sign of physical discomfort. This discipline was not born of fear, but of learning. He had come to interpret the environment not as an enigma to be deciphered, but as a hostile territory with its own rules. Respecting these rules became a form of survival. This change had a direct impact on the dynamics of the house. The most aggressive events decreased in intensity. They didn't cease, but they became more spaced out, almost observational. Sallie House seemed to respond to the change in posture, as if conflict lost part of its reason for existing when it was no longer fueled by active resistance. Deborah also underwent a visible transformation. Previously reacting intuitively to danger, she now acted with planning. She established a withdrawal schedule divided into short stages, avoiding abrupt movements that could provoke immediate reactions. Each object removed was treated as a silent concession, a calculated retreat from the territory. Their relationship strengthened in a practical way. There were no grand declarations or emotional reconciliations. Trust manifested itself in the coordination of actions, in the constant attention to each other's signals. Tony began to follow Deborah's decisions without excessive questioning, recognizing her more accurate perception of the environment. This shift in leadership was a silent milestone in personal growth. Tony's body began to respond positively to the change. The pain lessened, the wounds healed more evenly. There was no immediate medical explanation, but the correlation was too clear to ignore. The house seemed to react to the absence of direct provocation, as if it lost interest when no longer challenged. Still, new challenges arose. The logistics of the move revealed unexpected obstacles. Difficulties finding available transportation, unexplained delays, and minor glitches that accumulated. These weren't dramatic events, but they were enough to prolong the stay. The pressure increased as the time stretched beyond what was planned. Tony faced the urge to resume the investigation, especially given these delays. The desire to solve the situation, to understand the mechanism behind the obstacles, was strong. The real overcoming occurred when he resisted this impulse. Each time he chose not to investigate, not to confront, he reinforced a new way of acting. The house subtly tested this change. Distant sounds, peripheral movements, stimuli that would previously have provoked an immediate reaction. Tony learned not to respond. The absence of response seemed to weaken the cycle of action and reaction that had sustained the conflict until then. Observing this evolution, Deborah began to trust more in the outcome, not because she believed the house would allow for a peaceful exit, but because she saw in Tony's behavior a genuine adaptation. He no longer tried to control the uncontrollable. He accepted the operational reality of the risk. The protagonist's growth was consolidated not as a triumph, but as a reinterpretation. He left behind the need to dominate the unknown and adopted a posture of conscious self-preservation. This change did not erase what they had lived through, but created a concrete possibility of continuity outside that space. At the end of this stage, the couple was more prepared than ever to face whatever came next, not through force, nor through knowledge, but through alignment. The house remained active, attentive, but the game had changed. And for the first time, Tony wasn't reacting. He was choosing. The preparations for the final exit from Sallie House took place under a constant, silent tension, as if every step was being watched and evaluated. There was no more room for improvisation. Everything needed to be done with precision, within a rhythm that would neither provoke the house nor elicit a more severe reaction. Subplots began to resolve themselves naturally. The curious visitors disappeared completely, and the few residents who had previously observed from a distance began to avoid the street. The house seemed isolated from the rest of the city, as if it had withdrawn its influence within its own walls. This isolation brought no relief. It only reinforced the feeling that the final confrontation would be intimate without witnesses. Deborah coordinated the final details of the move with almost mechanical efficiency. The remaining belongings were minimal, chosen not for their material value, but for immediate necessity. Each object removed seemed to slightly relieve the pressure of the environment, but also provoked small signs of resistance, a prolonged creaking, an abrupt drop in temperature, lights that went out for endless seconds. Tony took on a more physical than investigative role. He avoided any prolonged contact with critical areas of the house, especially the basement. His attention was focused on time. The accumulated delay had already exceeded what was acceptable, and there was a persistent feeling that the house would not allow this gradual withdrawal indefinitely. The margin for error was decreasing with each passing hour. One last obstacle arose when the arranged moving service was cancelled without clear explanation. There was no immediate alternative. The unexpected stay for another night completely altered the carefully constructed balance. The house reacted immediately, not with explicit violence, but with an intensification of its presence. Constant footsteps upstairs, rhythmic knocks on the interior walls, sounds echoing from room to room as if accompanying their movements. Tension reached a new level. The night turned into a period of constant vigilance. Tony and Deborah remained together in the main room, avoiding separation. They didn't talk beyond what was necessary. Silence was a strategy. Any more intense emotional display seemed to fuel the activity in the house. During this vigil, one detail caught Tony's attention. The sounds followed a pattern similar to that recorded on the basement tape recorder. Regular, almost methodical rhythms. They weren't random. The house seemed to be keeping time, not as a direct threat, but as a countdown. This realization redefined the preparation for climax. It wasn't just about physically leaving the house, but about doing it at the right time. The house tolerated the withdrawal up to a certain point. The limit was still unknown, but it was close. Deborah proposed a change of strategy, to leave the house completely empty at once, without any intermediate returns. The decision implied abandoning some remaining belongings, but drastically reduced the time on display. Tony agreed without hesitation. The logic of preservation had finally overcome material attachment and intellectual curiosity. The early morning hours progressed slowly. The house maintained a constant state of activity, but without escalating. It was as if it were waiting for something specific. When the first sign of dawn appeared through the windows, the atmosphere seemed to quiet down for a moment. It didn't cease completely, but it receded enough to allow for action. The transport finally arrived in the early hours of the morning. The departure time was set. Every movement now carried definite weight. There would be no second attempt, no later adjustment. The preparation was complete. The subplots had been tied up, the decisions had been made, and the couple was aligned on a single objective: to cross that final threshold without provoking the reaction that the house seemed to contain. The climax wouldn't be announced. It was already in motion. The climax didn't explode in immediate violence. It built up in the instant Tony crossed the room for the last time, carrying the final box, feeling the house react in a way unlike anything they had ever experienced. There was no excessive noise, no abrupt movements. What prevailed was a uniform pressure, as if the entire space were contracting. The front door was open. The morning light streamed in at a low angle, casting long shadows across the floor. It was the first time since moving in that the house had seemed completely awake during the day, not overtly hostile, alert. Deborah was already outside, near the vehicle. When Tony took his first step toward the exit, the rhythmic pattern began again. It wasn't coming from a specific point. It was in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Soft, rhythmic beats, impossible to pinpoint. The sound didn't demand a reaction, but it imposed urgency. Tony stopped, not out of fear, but out of understanding. For the first time, he didn't try to ignore it nor overanalyze it. He realized that this was the limit the house had established from the beginning. It wasn't about preventing the exit, but about marking the end. Sallie House didn't want explanations nor public recognition. It wanted control over the final moment. The air grew heavier as he moved forward. Each step required increasing effort, as if he were traversing an invisible field of resistance. His heartbeat quickened. The rhythm wasn't chaotic. It was insistent, almost impatient. Then came the turning point. Upon reaching the doorframe, Tony felt a sudden pain in his chest, more intense than any previous one. There was no push, no direct physical attack. The pain caused him to fall to his knees just inches from the exit. The house had chosen that exact spot to strike. Deborah ran toward him, trying to pull him out. The instant she touched his arm, the pain ceased abruptly. Silence spread through the house instantly, completely. The thumping disappeared. The pressure dissolved as if it had never existed. Tony realized, while still on the ground, the antagonist's ultimate logic. The house didn't react to human presence indiscriminately. It responded to the challenge. Throughout the entire experiment, the most aggressive moments had occurred when someone tried to understand, measure, or confront the phenomenon. At that moment, Tony wasn't confronting or investigating. He was being removed. Sallie House didn't attack those who left. It attacked those who persisted. Deborah pulled Tony out with effort, without hesitation. The moment they both completely crossed the threshold, the front door closed by itself, with controlled firmness, without a bang. There was no attempt to reopen it. The house had accepted their departure. Outside, the surroundings seemed too normal. The distant sounds of the city, the light breeze, the sheer weight of the ground beneath his feet. Tony took a deep breath, feeling his body react as if it had been released from a constant burden. The pain did not return. The twist wasn't an explicit supernatural revelation, but the ultimate understanding. The house wasn't a chaotic entity or a childlike spirit trapped in the past. It was a space shaped by trauma, repetition, and response. A system that reacted to prolonged intrusion, not temporary presence. Tony had undergone his ultimate transformation. Not to conquer the house, not to explain it, but to recognize that there were limits that didn't need to be crossed to prove rationality or courage. The need to master the unknown had been replaced by a harder, more mature understanding. Some things exist independently of validation. As the vehicle drove away, Tony looked one last time at Sallie House. No windows opened, no shadows appeared. The house remained motionless, enclosed within itself. The conflict was resolved not by confrontation, but by retreat at the precise moment. The climax left no visible marks beyond the existing scars, but it left something deeper, the certainty that the real danger lay not in the inexplicable, but in humanity's insistence on remaining where it is not welcome. Life after Sallie House didn't immediately return to normal. There was no clear moment of transition, nor sudden relief. Adaptation occurred gradually, marked by long silences and the need to relearn simple routines without the constant expectation of a reaction from the environment. It took Tony weeks to get his sleep pattern back. The scars remained visible, but they stopped hurting. They became physical reminders of a period when his persistence had almost cost him more than he was willing to pay. He avoided speaking publicly about the experience, not out of fear of discredit, but because he recognized that any attempt at explanation would diminish something that only made sense within its own context. His transformation solidified in his daily life. Tony began to respect boundaries more naturally, both personal and professional. He abandoned the need to have immediate answers for everything. The house had taught him in a harsh way that understanding is not always a right. Sometimes it's a risk. Deborah adapted more quickly. The physical distance from Sallie House almost instantly reduced her anxiety symptoms. Still, she maintained habits acquired during the experience: locked doors, constant attention to her surroundings, a vigilance that wasn't fear but memory. Her growth lay in her confidence in her own perception. She had learned to act before confirmation, something she had previously hesitated to do. Their relationship emerged scarred, but not weakened. The experience redefined roles, strengthened silent cooperation, and eliminated minor disputes that had previously seemed important. They didn't talk about the house often, but they knew that understanding was shared. There was no need to revisit the trauma to validate it. Sallie House remained in Atchison, essentially untouched. New residents passed through it over time, some for short periods, others for longer. The accounts varied, but the pattern persisted. The house reacted to prolonged stays, to insistence. There was no spectacle, only wear and tear. The city continued to coexist with the house as it always had, with respectful distance and vague comments. Nothing was officially recorded, no definitive investigation was conducted. The house did not require institutional recognition. Its influence was local, intimate, and focused. The conclusion didn't provide definitive answers, but it established clear consequences. Those who tried to challenge or decipher Sallie House paid a price. Those who accepted their limitations and left at the right moment survived. Tony never returned, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Some experiences don't demand a return, only acceptance. The story of the house would continue to be told, fragmented, incomplete, exactly as the space seemed to require. Years later, Sallie House still stood silently on North 2nd Street. Recent photographs showed the facade intact, almost ordinary, as if nothing had happened there. Yet no one stayed for long. Reports came and went, always vague, always inconclusive. Tony, upon seeing one of those images by chance, felt only a brief pang in his chest. Not pain, but a memory. There was no regret. The house hadn't followed him. It had remained where it had always been. Some places don't need to be understood to exert influence. You only need to cross the threshold once to know when not to return. Stories like that of Sallie House don't end when the last page is turned. They continue in the silences, in the unanswered questions, and in the personal experiences of the reader. If this narrative has sparked unease, doubt, or curiosity, share your reflection. Do you believe that some places react to the people who occupy them, or can everything be explained by the weight of suggestion and fear? Leave your comment. Discuss with other readers and share this story with anyone interested in true mysteries and disturbing accounts. Sometimes, the scariest part isn't what happened, but what might happen again.